Good morning, church family, and welcome to church this morning. Jesus has just spent the last 3 years of his ministry with his disciples, teaching them and demonstrating who God is. They've been getting to know him on a personal level and interacting with him every day. And now it's not long until he's going to be going back to heaven, and he's trying to prepare his disciples for that time when he won't be with them. The stories in the parables in Matthew 25 are teaching us and trying to show us some practical ways that we can be vigilant and ready for the day that Jesus is coming back. Today we're going to be looking at the story of the final judgment, or the parable as you may know it, called the sheep and the goats. This parable is a parable about judgment, and it's important that Jesus makes it important that we know about the parable. Jesus wants us to know about judgment and his coming, because otherwise he wouldn't have spoken about it as many times as what he did. But I believe in this passage he's also trying to emphasise the things that we can do in a practical way to have hope and direction in our lives. I want to start reading from Matthew 25 verses 31, and we'll go through most of the passage throughout this morning. So from verse 31 he says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered in his presence." So in this particular verse here, Jesus is actually telling us that when he comes, it's going to be a really spectacular event. It's going to be grand, it's going to be global, and that everyone will be present, even the angels. It's interesting that as humans, we like spectacular, amazing, grand things, and Jesus is telling us that this event will be way more spectacular than anything we've ever imagined. We get to witness this public event of God's judgment, and we see his justice coming into play and how he's going to rule. Moving on to verse 32, he says, "And he will separate the people as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats at his left." This reference to the sheep and the goats in this part is actually quite interesting. It's the only part of the passage that we're looking at today that's a parable. The rest of it is talking about what's going to happen. And it's a little bit insignificant here, but it's possible that he's put this little bit into the passage because it's something that the people of his time could relate to. They saw the shepherds caring for their sheep and goats in the pastures, and they knew how the shepherds operated. It's also interesting that they couldn't always tell their sheep and goats apart, and that the only difference most of them had was that the sheep's tail hung down while the goat's tail was sticking up. Moving on to verses 34 and 5, he says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world.'" In this verse, Jesus is telling us clearly who he is. He's telling us that he's the king, that he's God's son, and that all those things that the people have heard from the Pharisees and the rulers of their day about how they need to follow the rules and the regulations are probably not that important, but the importance is on what he's about to tell them in terms of getting to the kingdom. Jesus is not separating people here by their status or whether they've obeyed the rules, by their wealth. He's using an entirely different way to distinguish them. And it's something that I guess he's been demonstrating the past 3 years during his ministry to his disciples. That reference to "come" in the verse is actually the first word Jesus speaks in Matthew to his disciples when he asks them to come and follow him. He asks them to leave their careers, their lives, and to follow him and become his disciples. It's also interesting that the word "come" used in these passages is the same Hebrew word that is used in the end of Revelation when he says, when he's calling his people to judgment. So it's kind of like a little bit of a parallel where he says, "Come, follow me," and then those people that follow me will enter into the kingdom that I've prepared for them. Moving on, he says, "For I was hungry and you fed me." Such a simple thing. "I was thirsty and you gave me a drink." Think maybe the woman at the well. "I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me." He didn't say, I'm sick, so I've healed you, or you're in jail, I'll set you free. No, it's simpler, it's more basic. There's no big, huge miracles happening here. It's just little tiny ministries and acts of kindness that we give people in our day. The emphasis here is on social service and widening of our hearts, noticing the people around us. Jesus is asking us to take our cues from him and not those around us. He's asking us and reminding us through stories in the Bible, like the woman at the well, the way Ruth cared for Naomi, and other stories in his ministry, that he noticed people. He demonstrated care for the people that were considered outcasts of society, lepers, unclean, the difficult to love people. And here in this passage, he's reminding us that they're the people he wants us to love, to the people that he cares and values, the people he's chosen. So how do I make a difference in the world? By intentionally and daily practicing slowing down so that I can stop and see the people that cross my path, the people that maybe I'd otherwise rush past or ignore or not notice. To try and get to know the difficult people, the people that are hard to love, the people I wouldn't normally mix with, that don't quite fit into my circle of influence, and invite them in. Try and make new friends with them. Try not to get distracted, but to be present so that I will see them and notice them. Psychology professor and author Richard Beck, in his book Stranger God, suggests the concept of think globally but love locally. And I think that's what this passage is talking about. By practicing these daily ministries in our everyday lives, we're going to make an impact on the world globally by, noticing and connecting with the one. Research tells us that we cannot change discrimination or issues in society through words and teachings alone. But it's by knowing people personally and getting to know them that we overcome these discriminations. Stereotypes are removed. By seeing and noticing the people in our daily lives, the little ministries. We counter emotional biases like racism, not by changing laws and policies, but by learning to love locally. And this goes for any little prejudice or bias that I might have. Jesus is asking me to intentionally approach people, to make contact. And this contact might seem simple, basic, too small, but, just a smile or a kind word. But repeated contact over a long period of time will widen the circle. It'll widen our hearts. Moving on, then the righteous will reply to the Lord, when did we ever see you hungry? When did we ever feed you or thirsty and give you something to drink and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick and in prison and visit you? And the king will say to them, I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. You brought me into your family circle, you took me in and you loved me. And we all have access, each one of us, to Jesus through maybe a lonely person or someone in need. By taking our cues from him, our love becomes a natural outflow from our lives, so much so that we probably won't even recognise it. Verse 40, and the king says, I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. I tell you the truth. The most important element of the story here is one. One needy person, one lonely person. Doesn't seem that important, but Jesus says one. The least of these, the least significant one. Look out for them. So what is Jesus' final instruction to us in this passage? What's my human responsibility? It's love for the one. We are called to love the Jesus who is standing in front of us. Like it says in the Beatitudes, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy.